Passos Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hi.
Hello, could I please speak with Rabih Alameddine?
Speaking.
Rabih, it's such a pleasure to have you on the line. Thank you so much for taking my call. Thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really, really delighted. Tell me, how have you been spending these last 3 or 4 months?
It's a good question because I've been joking for a while that not much has changed for me, and that I'm usually a homebody and I rarely leave the house except to go to my psychiatrist and to go to the gym. I miss the gym.
How about the psychiatrist?
We have Zoom calls.
How does that work?
I look at him and he looks at me across the computer and we talk. It's not bad, actually. For years, because I used to travel so much. He always says, well, we could do a Skype call. And no way, absolutely not. But now that I'm, been forced to do it, it's not so bad. It's actually preferable than, getting on a bus and going over there.
And do you find that speaking to a psychiatrist via Zoom has the same offers the same insights, the same solace, the same?
I don't know. We've been doing it for 3 months,
right?
Whereas I've been with him now for maybe 18 years. So we know each other rather well. So I'm not sure. I can't answer that. So far. And particularly, I saw him this morning, and that was, very helpful today. Really, really helpful. So sometimes I think it's just that we're at the stage where all it takes is one word, and I start thinking about things. But yeah, no, it's been helpful. I don't know if it's the same. I don't know if it's the same. This is one of the things that's been interesting about this whole situation, shall we call it? Because truly, I am not the most social of people. I do enjoy social situations and all that, but usually I come back home and I have to turn off for a while. What I'm noticing that's happening that is really strange is that I'm not sure. I'm getting less interested in meeting people and seeing people than as opposed to like most of my friends who want to go out and want to do things. I'm getting, less and less interested, so that every now and then somebody will say, well, let's go for a walk. And my first thought is, why?
What are you getting more interested in?
I'm not sure. Again, I think I'm becoming a little more blasé about things, and that's a problem. I'm reading more. I'm watching bad TV more. And I'm online more. But I think it's more the projects that the small projects that interest me that I'm interested in. But I think that's more of a fault on my part than anything else.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because, of course, we started to talk about you and your psychiatrist, and this situation, this change in you, which may not be a change. It may just be I think the pandemic has brought out certain features in ourselves and in society, obviously, and we'll get to society in a moment, and maybe exacerbated certain tendencies we have. You have said something that I find fascinating, which I'd love you to unpack, Rabih, for me. You've said, if I can't make fun of something, it has power over me. That is something that I figured out a while ago. Is there anything you are unable to make fun of at this moment?
At this moment, Well, there are many things that I'm able to make. Say, I'm able to make fun of the administration, for example, but at the same time, it hurts. One of the things that has been weird about this sort of whole administration, I never thought that I had as deep feelings for this country as I did. I don't consider myself a nationalist, and I'm definitely not a patriot. But one of the things that surprised me was that I actually do care. And I remember, again, I mean, this is going way 4 years. I remember when the imbecile, I used to call his name, when the imbecile was first coming up, and with the Republican debates, I was looking at, and I'm thinking like, oh, this is going to be so much fun. But then, even before he got elected, I started having this sort of deep depression of and not figuring out why until I realized that it wasn't fun. It was actually depressing. It was truly depressing. And that I realized then that, yes, my caring for this country has some power over me still. You know, and that was disturbing because, like I said, I'm supposed to be cynical and you know,
according to whom?
To me.
Okay.
It's like when I look in the mirror, I go, "You're such a good cynic. Thank you very much."
Okay. I just was wondering who do you need? Who tells you must be cynical? But it's your own self.
Yes, again, but that has a lot to do with, you know, what am I committed to? Because in some ways, cynicism is a commitment, or cynicism is a commitment to lack of commitment. And, you know, again, I've always thought cynicism was a cruel mistress. You know, it sucks a lot out of you, but it's a self-protection. And I realized then that that's one of the things that I can't really make fun of. I can make fun of the imbecile, but there's something that is truly disturbing that, you know, it still has power over me.
Do you have a similar feeling when and if you go to Lebanon?
With Lebanon, it's a different thing. You know, I actually have and do love Lebanon quite a bit, but I never had the delusions that I had about this country. You know, Lebanon has been a mess since I can remember, since anybody can remember, since its creation and even before its creation. And like many countries, you know, whether it's Italy or Nigeria or they pride themselves on being a mess. You know, this country, I moved here in many ways because I had these romantic notions of what this country is. Now, again, because of the AIDS crisis and because of all the wars that we've been through, these romantic notions, you know, dissolved a long, long time ago. I just was surprised that not all of them resolved, that I still had some feelings, you know, as much as I think that, you know, the whole idea of that this country is a democracy is a delusion, since basically, you know, you can't get anybody elected without paying billions of dollars.
Right. And
you know, so who's voting?
And also, what is so surprising to me, Rabih, in the recent past, is this whole notion of check and balances, which I thought meant something. Check and balances seems not to be present. I have to tell you, though, Rabih, I fell in love with Beirut.
As do I.
Really deeply. And it was a real pleasure, if I may make this little flirt to you, that everywhere I went, any bookstore I ever went to, your books were there front and center, which was wonderful to see. At that point, I didn't know at all that we would have the pleasure of speaking with each other, but I just fell in love with the country. I fell in love with Beirut. I traveled a little bit around. It was just magnificent, and I truly hope to go back someday when we can travel again. You have said, I haven't thought this through, but I believe all my novels are about a character who's on the brink. Might I suggest that the brink is where a writer resides? I'm curious, what is that brink? On the brink of what? And is it a precipice. It brought back to my mind, you know that I'm a quotomaniac by profession, and there's a wonderful line of Edward Albee where he says, all my plays are about people missing the boat, coming to the end of their lives with great regret at things not done. And I'm wondering if in some way those two might go together, and if you can tell me a little bit about that precipice and the anguish I imagine that comes from being on a precipice.
Well, I don't know how much I could go into it because I still haven't thought about it that much. But, one of the differences between what Edward Albee was saying and what I'm saying is that I'm looking at it from at a different stage of life, because I have no doubt that, all artists will reach the end of their life and have a lot of regrets. But the idea is that, to be able to write, to do good work, I believe, and I'm not sure how true it is, that one has to be on a precipice, that you feel the danger of what you're about to do. And most of us never actually jump.
Right.
And I think maybe I'm extrapolating, but I think that maybe what Edward Albee is saying is that, most of the regret is that we've never jumped,
right.
that we're just always on the edge. But then, who knows what happens when you jump.
Kind of a liminal space.
Yes. But see, the thing is, there is a line, and I cannot quote it directly because it's not in front of me, from Patrick White, from the Twyborn Affair, I think. Or maybe, no, I think it's from the Vivisector, where he says that all art is about longing, all life is about longing, and that the artist is nothing but a vessel to be able to contain that longing. And I have to find the exact quote, but I think it's a Vivisector.
It brings me to a passion I think you and I really share for Fernando Pessoa.
Oh my God!
And he said, you've said he's sort of my idol because he doesn't need an outside world. He has all of this inside of him. That's how I feel as a human being. I could live by myself. And may I read to you my favorite quotation of Pessoa? I just love it, and then I'd love you.
I might be able to complete it for you, but yes, go ahead.
And then I want you, Rabih, to react to it, but also to react to your very comment when I mentioned the word of Fernando Pessoa, and you said, oh my God, the feelings that hurt most, the emotions that sting most, are those that are absurd, the longing for impossible things precisely because they are impossible, the nostalgia for what never was, the desire for what could have been, regret over not being someone else, dissatisfaction with the world's existence. All these half-tones of the soul's consciousness create in us a painful landscape, an eternal sunset of what we are. That, for me, is... I come back to it again and again and again. And in a way, it's another way of saying what Albee said, and perhaps another way of talking in part of what you meant by the brink and the precipice, but maybe not. Anyway, the floor, as it were, Rabih, is yours.
Well, the interesting thing about this quote is I did not remember it, but I definitely paraphrased it and used it as mine. I think I said something in Unnecessary Woman that nostalgia is felt as keenly as nostalgia for things that never were.
Right.
Something of that effect, which is what he's saying. I believe my favorite quote of his is that he is drowning in a lake that he could stand in. Something that can't remember them offhand. But there are many quotes, and primarily from the Book of Disquiet, which is a massive piece. I think I've written, or maybe recycled the same essay. I've written about 3-4 essays, all of them short, on Pessoa and the Book of the Squad. But primarily him, and again, I used him as sort of as inspiration for an unnecessary woman. Is I'm fascinated by the idea of not having an audience. Because one of my primary sort of one of the things that I hate about myself is my need for, constant need for outside validation, my constant need to be understood and appreciated, and why aren't they reading me and they're reading that person, or and that is so, in many ways, so sad and so time wasting. And I always wondered, what would it be like? So when I started writing An Unnecessary Woman, the whole idea was somebody who had similar tendencies to me, just as neurotic, just as, but unlike me, she's not excused by society by going, oh, well, he's a writer. She's not. And I was fascinated by that, and then I realized that by the time the book ended and it got published and people were going, oh, it's such a tragic figure. And they were looking at the figure as that, she didn't have people in her life as tragic. And I look at that with envy. Not that I don't want people in my life, but that she did not need validation. She was doing her work and only she read her work. And I find that truly inspiring, and I could never achieve that. And I think Pessoa in many ways did.
How beautiful! How beautiful! Also, because it brings us back to the earlier part of our conversation, and perhaps an unresolved need you're feeling now to not need others. Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I have the same urges as most people, which is, what is life without others? If I don't interact, and isn't life really about relationships? And then at the time, I think no. It might be for many people, and it might not be for me. I don't know, but I can tell you that the need for intimacy and in some form of companionship and to be seen and understood is just as powerful as the need to be separate. Right. So there's this constant struggle. And I don't know about Pessoa. Did he have the same thing? I just find that he was able to at least resolve one part of it, which is that he was able to be by himself and do his best work without anybody going, this is good. I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not.
Have you been to Lisbon ever?
Yes, of course. And I sat on his lap.
Yeah. Isn't it? No. So we did something similar. However silly it might be, it's moving. I did that last year. Going to Trieste and just in search of Svevo and in search of Rilke and in search of Jan Morris. There's something quite moving about this. But maybe the companionship in part that fulfills you, I imagine, is a companionship of books and literature. And I have a question here, which comes from Mona El Tahawi. And Mona, knowing that I would talk to you, wanted me to ask you this. What is a poem you read again and again? The poetry that you post via your poetry blog sustains me, Mona says. I'd love to know what of all these magnificent poems sustains you. And there might be just such a poem that sustains you that you could even read if you so wished.
Again, picking one is so difficult.
Okay, two.
Well, let's put it. My favorite poem is Tithonus by God. What is his name? Tennyson.
Right.
But no, that's not. That's the poem that made me fall in love with poetry in many ways. But the poem that I go back to every now and then, whenever I need it, is I'm assuming I've talked enough that I don't have to explain that I'm by nature depressive, shall we say. And so I tend to like things that are the opposite, or that are able to, in many ways, lift me up. Actually, I can read it because I just pulled it up on my computer.
Wonderful. Please do.
This is one of my favorite poets, and I think he's so underappreciated. His name is Edward Hirsch. I think he was Poet Laureate, but I'm not sure. One of our greatest living poets. And this is a poem called "Happiness Writes White." Happiness writes white. I am a piece of chalk scrawling words on an empty blackboard. I am a banner of smoke that crosses the blue air and doesn't dissolve. I don't believe that only sorrow and misery can be written. Happiness, too, can be precise. Doctor, there's a keen throbbing on the left side of my chest where my ribs are wrenched by joy. Wings flutter in my shoulders and blood courses through my body like waves cresting on a choppy sea. Look, the eyes blur with tears and the tears clear. My head is like skylight. My heart is like dawn. This is one of the most beautiful poems I've ever read.
What do you love about it?
First of all, the whole idea that for most of us, for a lot of us, we almost always write about sorrow. Happiness is really
it's very hard to write about happiness.
To capture it, it's very ephemeral, yet he does capture it. And what I love about it is the images that he just uses. The last two lines, my head is like skylight, my heart is like dawn. It's like, just, stab me with a knife already.
Yeah.
This is just think about how I express happiness. Stab me with a knife.
It brings to mind a wonderful line in Stendhal's autobiography, La vie de Henri Brulard, the life of Henri Brulard. He talks about having gone to the opera and being asked after the opera, having heard Cimarosa, Il matrimonio segreto, he's asked by someone to say what he thought of it, and he dreads it because he wants to stay quiet and silent with the feeling. And he has this line, which I'll say in French and then quickly translate in English. He says, "J'eus l'enfance de parler de mon bonheur." I had childishness to speak about my happiness. Happiness is so hard to state without it sounding corny.
Actually, I could go on and on and on.
Go ahead.
The thing with that, I actually don't like to talk about many things. Part of the trouble for me, whenever I go to a movie, if I really, really like it, I don't want to be with anybody to talk about it. One of the things that I in my last book that I wrote about is that for a novelist, this is not on the brain, but for a novelist, one has to be, for any kind of painter, or to sit with the not knowing. That if I see something or watch something or listen to something, if I try to explain it quickly, it loses its mystery, it loses its hold. And I find it fascinating that for most people, they want a quick explanation of something that explains what is happening.
Right.
And in my opinion, that goes against everything that I consider sort of important about literature or art, which is that
or anything that demands to be decanted,
or to be anything that demands to be engaged with.
Right.
So anyway,
you wrote an essay which I just read, Rabih, which I think is fantastic, called "Comforting Myths" in Harper's Magazine. I think maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I can't quite remember, but very recently. And you say, oftentimes, war novels make us feel bad, and at the same time, allow us to see ourselves as the good guys. We are not all terrible, for we suffer too. I'm wondering how you feel about your own statement and also your own statement in the light of what we're living through today. Sorry.
No. It's a difficult thing, but if we don't want to talk about war novels, we can talk about social media. It's the whole idea of resistance through social media. That it for many people it reconfirms that we are, and let's just take it in this country, but every other country has the same problem. That we are good people. That the president we have is the exception, and look how good we are because we are resisting online. But the truth of the matter, it's like all these bad things are happening, and we think we're doing good. But it's the whole idea of what we're doing is just to make ourselves feel better, but it changes very little. It's like whether now, of course, I will vote for Biden, and yes, this imbecile has been one of the worst things that has ever happened to this country, et cetera, et cetera. But whether it is, the imbecile is just an extreme case of the same systematic problem that we're not dealing with. But what the social media does is it allows us to think that we are good people, but we're not. We allow these things to happen, so that's what it's the same thing for war novels. It's the same thing for me. It makes us feel good.
But you enjoy social media, and I think you particularly enjoy Twitter, and I enjoy seeing what you post. And one of the things that I love that you post are paintings. And I know that you yourself were or perhaps still are a painter. And
I would modify it with terrible.
Okay,
but yes, go ahead.
All right. Well, in your next session you can talk about that. But for the moment, Rabih, and in closing and briefly, sadly, it makes no difference, as you said before, whether we do or don't post. But you enjoy doing it, so it makes a difference of the pleasure it gives you. Why do you do it, and what are you trying to convey? Let's start with primarily it becomes an obsession. I'm fascinated by how I could work with images in succession. We know what makes a thread interesting and what makes a thread not interesting. I'm of course interested in other people seeing it, but for the most part, I don't really look at the reaction. I'm just interested in what makes it. But here's the thing: I think I think almost everything is useless. It doesn't change much. But it is what I have decided is important to me. So it's like whether it is writing or painting or doing my taxes or posting these threads on Twitter. They are what even if life is meaningless, I am assigning meaning to my life through this. So what an extraordinary comment! It reminds me of that wonderful line in Camus where he says, "One has to love life before loving its meaning. When the love of life has left us, no meaning can any longer console us."
Absolutely. So I know for a fact that whether I write a book or don't write a book, the world is going to keep going.
Yeah.
But I decided that I love writing a book, and it's really important to me. So you know what?
I'll do it.
It's important. I'll do it. I will. It's like it might be meaningless, but I'm gonna do it.
Rabih, what a pleasure it's been to speak to you, and I hope when this too passes, I will have the opportunity of taking a walk with you, and that you won't say, "Oh my God, I'd prefer staying at home." Maybe just once we will. But for now, Thank you so much, and thank you for this generous phone call. And take good care, stay safe, and until soon.
Thank you so much, and same back at you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.